Hello humans, welcome to a new episode of Psicoactivo. This will be in Spanish for all the audiences who are just starting to visit us thanks to that podcast I had with Fepo from the Paranormal Podcast. Today is a very special day for me because last December there was you could say, virtual convention commemorating the 30th anniversary of the disappearance of Dr. Jacobo Grinberg, and I had the honor of being invited to talk about what I've been investigating about the doctor's case. The truth is that I was fortunate to see several people there who presented, and I was very surprised. One of those people is my guest today on Psicoactive. I'd like you to welcome Dr. Ines Urdaneta, directly from Venezuela and Mexico City. Welcome, doctor. How are you?
Hello, Pavel. How are you?
Very happy. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. Well, that event you're talking about was also very, very cool.
From the conversation we had, I heard you talk about a holographic theory. And to start with, pretend as if no one knows what your work is about. Could you tell us what you are, what your PhD is in, and what your main work is?
Well, look, I'm actually a physicist. Well, I studied chemistry for my undergraduate degree in Venezuela. From there, I went on to do a master's degree in chemistry, still theoretical chemistry, in quantum optics, which brought me closer to physics. Then I did all this in Venezuela at Simón Bolívar University. Then I did my PhD in France in physics, in nanotechnology. But I always maintained a line that was theoretical on the one hand and was light-matter interaction on an atomic molecular scale. That was always my area of research for many years. I worked both in analytical theory, analytical development of equations, and in computational numerical calculations. Both are different areas of theory. In fact, they are distinguished as theoretical and computational chemistry or physics. There's like that separation, and I was a bit in both. Then, well, due to very interesting coincidences, I came across the holographic theory. It is called Generalized Holographic Theory because it is a generalization of the holographic principle and who promoted it at that time. Holographic theory exists. It is the theory most commonly used to describe how black holes behave because the theory is supposed to be decoded at the event horizon of a black hole. There's a whole theory behind black holes that is based on information theory and holographic theory, the holographic principle. It turns out that this person who developed this generalization was not an orthodox physicist as such. He's a person who had studied physics, let's say, on his own for his entire life, about 30 years. Well, at one point it was a little less, about 20 years. And he had found a way to describe information not only on the surface of a system, but also in the volume. A unit had been found, let's say, from which one could say, well, this unit is going to pixelate. It's like the bit of information that makes up space. That is as if space-time were composed. These bits of information are coined as Planck spherical units. Planck spherical units, which are spheres with a radius or diameter equal to the Planck length. That's how you understand it. The interesting thing was that when I read that theory for the first time, I was captivated because without using fitting parameters, I was able to predict through a surface volume to volume ratio of information transfer the rest mass of the proton. Without adjustment parameters and with calculations so simple that if a person had training in adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing, they could already do the calculations. I mean, it was such a simple thing. Yes, I mean, we are comparing. Exactly, yes, I mean, he understood the problem so well. I mean, you understand it so well that you can describe it in such simple terms. While the competing theory is the standard model of particle physics theory, which requires 17 fitting parameters, a Lagrangian that just by looking at it is unapproachable. You need to have completed a postdoc to understand how to calculate the mass of a proton. You need to understand the Higgs mechanism. That is, I am talking to you about a complexity that requires a lifetime to understand. While here with an equation, in fact, I could have prepared a slide to explain just that simple equation. But anyway, let's not get too technical. This principle, understanding that you can somehow understand what the energy content of a system is and what energy content that system is capable of transferring to the environment. And understanding that information rate between the surface of the volume, you had the rest mass of the proton, unusual. But that energy, I mean, of course, when I see that equation, I say there has to be an error here. But the calculations were so simple that I could redo them. Anyone could do them with a minimal base of, and if you have knowledge of physics, then you can be more critical in the study, because suddenly doing the calculations, it's not enough that they give you, but you also have to understand that they are doing those calculations. When I finished doing all those calculations, I say, but this is something brilliant, because they predicted things like, of course, the energy content that we are estimating for the proton is underestimated because we are not understanding how much internal energy the proton really has. We think that in the standard model of particles, it is equated with the strong nuclear force, the force that holds protons together in the nucleus. It is a force of a very high value, which is what would give, let's say, an atom the ability to not disintegrate, because protons supposedly have the same charge and should repel each other. But in an atom, you have many protons very close together, which is what the strong nuclear force keeps them close together. And inside each proton are the quarks. And what is it that keeps the quarks together inside so they don't come apart? The force of color they call. We're talking about a number of forces that appear in the standard model that are very complex to understand, that require many adjustment parameters, and that cannot be unified with the force of gravity. It's also important to understand that there is a separation that has been irreconcilable between the strong forces of the nuclear atom and the force of gravity, and that this other theory unifies it in a way that doesn't require adjustment parameters, in a completely fluid way, and they all turn out to be gravity at different scales. The force of gravity would be the force then. Why? Because this theory predicts that the protons at their center have a black hole. If you actually estimate the amount of energy that exists in the proton, it's enormous. It's 10 to the 14th power or even stronger, but let's say where one would consider the event horizon of the proton, there you still have an energy mass of 10 to the 14th g, which is enormous. 10 to 14 g would be the equivalent of a proton-sized black hole, with the proton's charge radius being known, well, more specifically the proton's Compton radius. I'm throwing around a lot of very technical terms here, but just in case any physicist comes across this video and suddenly gets excited.
If a lot of scientists see us, then they will understand quite well.
Okay, yeah, that's why I'm going into a little more detail. So what happens in the end? So then you have that the strong nuclear force is actually the force of attraction between two black holes, two black hole-like protons. So, and hence the theory. So this theory has like two stages. The artisanal stage, which consisted of articles that were published in journals that were not high impact. During that period, from 2012 to 2019, several articles were published that left me no room for doubt. In fact, I was already participating as part of the team by the time the last three came out, which was the same one used for the proton. It was used to estimate the mass of the electron, and it came out perfect. That is, it came out without any adjustment parameters perfectly. And it also came out to solve a problem called the vacuum catastrophe. The vacuum catastrophe is a problem in physics that concerns the estimation made by general relativity and quantum mechanics of the energy density of the vacuum. One estimates a vacuum density that is 122 orders of magnitude larger than the other. That is, there is an incredible incompatibility between the vacuum energy density estimated by quantum mechanics and that estimated by general relativity. That is, they are incompatible. So there we have another problem of incompatibility between one thing and the other. These all relate to a problem known in physics as the unification problem. The forces are not unified. As I mentioned before, the scales are not unified. There is no reference frame, a reference frame that scales. You see, that's the problem. There is no frame of reference that can change scale. We don't know how to scale the reference frame. I would put it in those terms, wouldn't I?
And well, before I continue, because the presentation in which I learned about your work talks about how you integrated Jacobo's work and synergistic theory into this. Is that where we're going next in our conversation?
Yes, that's where we're going.
Okay.
Why does it happen? It turns out that if the proton has these black hole capabilities, it means that it very possibly has many of the properties that one attributes to black holes. Among those would be, for example, well, entanglement, because the black hole is a very important creature in physics because it is the creature that could allow us to unify the scales. Because the quantum scale is the scale of the very small, the scale of atoms and molecules and subatomic particles, where gravity is supposed to have no great effect because they are supposedly very light, but that is the mass that we measure externally. but internally they have an amount of energy that infinitely curves space-time. That is what is still not understood in mainstream physics. While in black holes, the most opposite scale, which is the cosmological scale, black holes are supposed to be pure gravity, which is an impressive gravitational effect, which is so impressive that not even light can escape. And yet it also has important quantum effects. It is then assumed that the creature that would unify both scales is the black hole, which exhibits extremely quantum and relativistic behavior. What is one of those extreme behaviors that a black hole would have? And as predicted by the generalized holographic theory that has the boxes, the pixels, where the information is encoded on its border, the border of the black hole has wormhole-like connections. Those are all wormhole-type connections. If they are wormholes, does that mean that what you have there, because what other value does the theory estimate, is incredible? It estimates that the mass, if you calculate the energy content in the proton, no longer taking into account its surface area, only the volume of the proton, you have 10 to the 55 Yoff density in the volume of the proton. That is the equivalent mass of the universe. If you exactly the entire mass of the universe estimated with the Eddington number, it seems to me that is the one that is used. If you estimate the number of protons in the universe is 10 to the 55th power, and you compress it into 1 cubic cm, you would have 10 to the 55th cubic cm. And this is what you have here in a proton. What is this telling you? He's telling you that the proton contains, in some incredible way, all the information in the universe. All the information of the universe in each proton. What does this mean then? That the proton is the holographic unit of the universe? If the proton is the holographic unit of the universe, it means the time, the refresh time that the universe has to update its information, because we have to see if they all contain the same information. That is, they have to have a very high information speed, information flow rate to update. We have estimated that speed in theory. Theory tells you it's 10 to the 40th times the speed of light. 10 to the 40 times. I mean, it's not 40 times the speed of light. No, it's 10 to the 40th. That is in the exponent, no. That is, it is infinitely fast. That is the speed of entanglement, the quantum entanglement that is predicted by quantum mechanics, but which does not explain what its mechanism is. Quantum mechanics predicts the existence of entanglement, but does not explain its mechanism. This theory does explain it and tells you that there is an entanglement network through these protons that has a speed of 10 to 40 times the speed of light. That means that the refresh time of the universe, a bit of information is immediate for that speed. We are static at the speed at which that information is moving. That's why we call it instant. We think it's an instantaneous speed. We, on the other hand, are like this for that scale. We haven't moved in billions of years. We are static, so it is important to understand relativities, relative velocities, relative spaces, because that's the most complicated part of holographic theory. Understanding orders of magnitude, the differences we're talking about between scales, between speeds, and all of that.
Now, what did Jacob King's theory say?
He said that space was a holographic matrix of extremely high coherence in its fundamental state. That is exactly what generalized holographic theory predicts. In the Beisel state of greater, which is the most energetic, coherence is absolute. So what do I mean by this? This network of entanglement that the protons produce is a network of entanglement of the proton in its nucleus, in its black hole, which is what is most in the center. And the further you go towards the proton, towards its center, the more coherence there is. You could imagine them as these vacuum fluctuations like rotors, as if they were rotors of the quantum field. In the quantum field, let's say they are rotating at an impressively high speed at an angular velocity, which is the spin. And this spin is so high, and when you're very close to it, to the center of rotation, it's so high and produces so much coherence that that regime up to there, which doesn't last very long, the distance is very short where that coherence regime is maintained, but the coherence in that regime is very high. And when you have an energy density that is infinite, because it has to do with the vacuum fluctuations, those vibrations, those rotors are in tandem, in unison. They are all together as if they were little balls that are all spinning at the same speed. They are all coherently vibrating at that same frequency, which is the Planck frequency, which is a very high speed. The energy there is very high. So let's put this into colloquial terms. What are we saying? The entanglement network. First, the universe is a network of entanglement. That universe of entanglement network is true protons, which are the holographic units. But these holographic units, which are the protons, are in turn composed of these voxels, of those pixels of information that I mentioned at the beginning, which are the Planck spherical units. It is the unit with which you are able to calculate the energy content of any system. Because it's like I'm telling you, okay, I have an account, there's $100 in my account. Well, how can I tell you there's $100? Because I have the unit of peso, which is what allows me to say that I have $100. You need unity of energy. That unity did not exist. There was no unity. They had tried to estimate, but they had used geometries that were not appropriate. When you try to estimate the energy content of a system, you need a unit that is the true one, the one that actually applies. And you have to correctly estimate what its geometry is. A cubic geometry was used, not a spherical one. If you use a cubic instead of a spherical unit for that unit, then the density is no longer calculated the same. So let's say there were small deviations, but on the quantum scale, they are very large. You can't have a deviation, even if it's very small. If that scale is so small, the difference becomes very large. So what I'm getting at is that the idea of having a unit that voxelates space, that allows you to pixelate space, is an idea that's not new. That idea has been around for 50 years or more. The thing is, he hasn't found the appropriate way to describe that unit of energy. And that unit of energy was the one estimated by this person, who I feel doesn't give himself enough credit for, because although it seems very simple to have said, well, the unit is a spherical Planck unit with the radius, with the Planck diameter, it turns out that when you calculate the energy density in a system like that, everything works out smoothly. You can now understand what the energy content is that exists in a proton, that exists in an electron, that exists in a cosmological black hole. And everything is happening without parameters, I tell you, without adjustment parameters. When you look at the theory, it goes something like this. This theory is currently being developed. Initially, in its artisanal stage, it was being carried out when I joined the team. We were Torus Tech and Resonance Science Foundation. That's what it was called at that time, until 2023. When it changed its name and is now called the International Space Federation. And working in that organization is the director, who is Nassim Harame, who is not a physicist, who is an unorthodox physicist, let's put it that way. And right now on the team are Olivia Lirol, a nuclear physicist who worked on priming, and Cyprien Germont-Press, a fluid mechanics physicist who graduated from Polytechnique. I'm telling you that they are people. I'm at the atomic molecular scale. I'm from the University of Paris 11. I did my PhD at the University of Paris, also in France. There's another guy, William Brown, who's the biophysicist. So I'm telling you that even if this person didn't have, let's say, the official credentials of a doctorate, he's surrounded by people who do. So that is important to note. Another thing that is perhaps very important here is the theory of vacuum fluctuations. What are vacuum fluctuations? What is space really? Understanding what space really is the key to unraveling all the mysteries that still remain, as if they were science fiction, magic, paranormal esotericism, but it's because we don't understand the nature of space.
There's also a scientist, this self-taught polymath called Bob Greenyer. Do you know him?
No.
He talks about toroidal movements, and the name of the before they came together caught my attention. That torus has to do with that, right? With a toroid, which is like a thing like that with many circles. He talks about that, and he thinks that this information he's sharing with us is eternal information that civilizations suddenly forget, but there comes a point in different stages of civilizations where they remember this information. And I feel like you guys, and Bob Greenyer too, is part of this new group of scientists who are remembering this information, because the information is always there, I feel, right?
Yes, the information is there. The topic of the toroid is very interesting. It's called the tech torus for exactly that reason, because there's the behavior of the Planck flow. I was just talking to you about the artisanal stage, where one estimated the energy content, but it's a very simple thermodynamic steady-state calculation. We haven't put everything there yet. Now, in the non-artisanal stage, the already very complex stage, there are calculations, let's say, that have to do with vacuum fluctuations, with second-order quantization, more complicated calculations. There, everything that needed to be demonstrated is being demonstrated. So we had a theory that did show that it was giving the right thing, but it didn't explain very well why. Now, the question of why the electromagnetic force and gravitational force can be easily unified is being carefully analyzed. Are you understanding? This is very important because it allows you to understand where matter really comes from, what matter is, what mass is, because that is not understood. They tell you yes, but it's a lie, it's a lie. The Higgs mechanism, which is what supposedly came out like wow, and the God particle, the Higgs boson, and all this that was detected at CERN, that only describes 2%, from 2 to 4% of matter. The rest is the strong nuclear force, the confining force. That's what they try to explain the so-called gluons. Let's say the theory is highly complex with many adjustment parameters, and it doesn't allow for evolution, it doesn't allow for progress. String theory, for example, which is one of the theories that tries to unify scales, still has no predictions, it cannot be predicted. That is, modern physics is very stagnant at the moment. Modern physics is already very stagnant.
Was that all the word I was thinking when
I was stuck, and many physicists are already saying it openly, you know? Jose Eric Weinstein, that is, they are people who are saying, gentlemen, there is a whole community that follows our work a bit, because I wrote an article on the scale at the electron level, that is of the vacuum fluctuations at the electronic level, which is called through a phenomenon known as Zitterbiegen. It's a German word that means to vibrate while moving. There is a vibration in subatomic particles called Zitterbewegung, and it has to do with vacuum fluctuations. And I did a review on that topic and discovered a whole community of physicists who understand that the quantum field, that vacuum fluctuations are the origin of mass. From this arises the mass of vacuum fluctuations in the coherence regime. But it is a large community, but that community is not having any impact and prefers quantum mechanics, which is the predominant one, which says that the quantum field, that is, let's say, what the vacuum would be, are random fluctuations of particles that disappear, appear, and disappear at such a high speed that there would be no violation in the principle of conservation of mass. I mean, but it's all random. According to that premise, the universe is inherently probabilistic and arises from chance. And that is impossible. It's impossible. You cannot have order through chance. I mean, it's like, a plane is going to come out, I have all these pieces all super messed up, and suddenly they're going to organize themselves in some way. And here I have a plane created. No, the universe is highly negentropic. It's rather the opposite. We are a highly negentropic system that is ordered. The opposite, nentropic, very orderly. And it becomes more disordered as you move away from those sources of coherence, which are the rotors I'm talking about. So lattice in its most basic regime is highly coherent. That is, it is of a very high energy and deeply coherent.
many call it the source?
Exactly, the source. It is the source. And what happens, that quantum mechanics and all these theories of modern physics, the source is not taken into account. The source knows how to say it. She was neglected. That is, it is ignored because it adds to the theory. So on average, it gives 0. It is an energy that is very high, but fluctuating, but in all directions, on average, 0. So at our scale, that energy is 0. No, it turns out that on our scale, that energy has already lost so much coherence that what we see is only the entropic part, the part that has already lost almost all of its information, but at its core, the source is extremely coherent and has very high energy.
So yes, there is something that really catches my attention when I go to the International Space Federation website, where they talk about trying to extract energy from the energy of to try to get the energy out of there. This is a concept, as we well know, from Dr. Miguel Alcubierre, and there have been some interactions that I've seen from him where I think he's really fueled this stigma that exists between those who are considered orthodox within the scientific community and those who are considered heretics within the scientific community. I believe Dr. Alcubierre is one of those considered orthodox based on the interactions I've seen him have. He says that, his theory says that it is possible, but that it requires an incredibly high amount of energy, right? And based on what you're telling me, I think that energy isn't as incredible as one might imagine. If possible, what do you think about this stigma against some people in the scientific community who dare to research this? And this idea that the Alcubierre warp drive can't draw energy from anywhere because it doesn't exist or because it's impossible, because it's too powerful?
Yes, there is a misunderstanding there. Just like I was saying before, if you don't really understand what space is, what its properties are, then you can't really move forward and you're stuck. That's what I've seen. Yes, I have listened to Miguel's presentations. Alcubierre subdrive effectively requires more negative energy. I mean, it's all very complex. And I would agree that from that perspective, we couldn't get energy from there. But that's not what we're saying here. That is here, look, we would have to first understand that space is composed, let's say, of these fluctuations of the vacuum, which are really what they are. Okay, in theory, we model rotors that are real. That is, it is not a theoretical idealization. It is a real mechanical movement of a fluid that is, it would be space as a fluid, a superfluid as they call it, with very high spin properties, because these rotors are precisely rotors. Spinners. And then what if you see how you calculate the coherence regime of those spinners up to a certain distance? In fact, the non-artisanal part, the more, let's say, professional part of these calculations are telling us that using the correlation functions that are used in physics, in quantum optics, and using those correlation functions in the coherence regime that they are delimiting for you, which is the coherence regime up to a certain distance. If you put the distance, for example, of the proton as if it were a resonance cavity, as if it were a Casimir cavity, when you put that distance between these equations, it gives you the rest mass of the proton. That is, it is telling you directly that the mass of the proton is arising from the coherence and decoherence of vacuum fluctuations. And this is being done without any adjustment parameters. I'm telling you, this is something amazing. That is the other previous calculation in which we use these Planck balls to estimate the energy content in a volume, and then the one on the surface and make the surface volume ratio. Now we're doing a completely different calculation that has to do with the coherence regime of vacuum fluctuations, which are being described in a way through orthodox quantum mechanics, let's say. And it's giving you that when you put in the radius, the distance of what would be the radius of the proton, it gives you that you have a proton there. The rest mass, the energy that the system has, is the energy of the proton. It can be calculated in 4 different ways, and all 4 give the same value, the same solution. They're telling you that we're actually understanding what vacuum fluctuations are and how mass emerges from vacuum fluctuations. It is also understood that there are 2 energy shielding processes. A process that is, you have these rotors, this highly coherent rotor that generates synergy, let's say, around it with other rotors that are all rotating in unison. That rotation is going to reach a point where it's going to start to be decoherent. The vibrations are going to start to become coherent. So from that radius onwards, what we would call the decoherence of the system begins, and it begins to lose energy, mass. It's how it starts to lose energy to the point that at the end of that boundary, what you measure is the rest mass of the proton. So there are 2 borders. The inner boundary is the black hole boundary of the proton. That black hole boundary is what corresponds to, when you calculate the energy, that distance is the Compton energy of the proton. That Compton energy of the proton corresponds to, at the Compton radius of the proton, with an energy of 10 to the 14th, which is what I said before, 10 to the 14th G. And then from there, that second border is a little further ahead. That is further out in the center of rotational vibration. And that would be the proton charge radius, which is what is known as the proton charge radius, and which was estimated with a very high value of experimental precision than the one that currently exists in CODATA. In the CODATA values, there is that value of 0.84 and other decimals. So this whole story of what would be the history of the proton charge radius, there is an article on IASEF's science blog where it is explained, because it corresponds to the artisanal stage of the calculation that Nassim Haramein did at that time with Amira Balbaker, who is an astrophysicist, who now, etc. She's not on the team, but she's an astrophysicist from England. He wrote 3 articles with her. One is about the electron, the other was about the vacuum catastrophe, and there's another article in a third one that I don't have in mind. Now I want to talk to you about the second stage. 2 articles have emerged from this second stage, which began in 2023. One was sent to Nature. It's called The Origin of Mass and the Nature of Gravity. That article alone, from the moment it came out until now, when it's on the Zenodo server, has had 70,000 downloads. More than 70,000.
What madness.
Crazy.
For those who don't understand, a good scientific article has 10,000 at most or 15,000 at most.
7,000.
It's crazy.
It's crazy. It's crazy. Of course, it's crazy. Now, what happened when the reduced version was sent to Nature? Because that article by Senodo is like the preprint that one sends as if to say, gentlemen, here it is. This article was sent so that people already know. It's like a copyright issue too. But it turns out that the reduced version, which was only 10, 12 pages, was sent to Nature. And what do you think happened? Nature has not commented. That is, they agreed to review it. It's something incredible. I'll tell you, Peter Miloni. Okay, look, what is the refereeing system like? What is this system like? You have an idea, let's say revolutionary, you want to publish it in an article in an important magazine, but you're not a well-known person, someone has to sponsor you. Okay, one of the most important textbooks used to do these calculations was a book by Peter Miloni, which dealt with exactly these topics. And Peter Miloni was contacted directly by the team to say, hey, we've used your work and we want you to review this article, and what do you think? And if you can sponsor us? The gentleman said, this is it. He loved it. He said, yes, I support them. We're talking about a world-renowned expert, Peter Miloni, supporting the work of unknowns, including someone who has even had a very bad reputation on the internet because he doesn't have the degree. So, well, this person endorses the article, an editorial letter is sent to the editor of Nature magazine, and the editor agrees to review the article. That means they have to give it to some evaluators who are anonymous. These evaluators will give their opinion. The first feedback they got from the reviewers was basically that they hadn't read the article and that everything it said was impossible. They didn't say criticism, they said this can't be because of this, and this. In other words, they let it be seen that they had not read the article. So they appealed, Peter Miloni appealed, he said no, to have received this level of response, they would not have accepted the article for review. They appealed, the editor said yes, that's true, they're right, we're going to send it back to other referees. Other referees sent it to them, I'm talking about a year and a half ago, and to this day they haven't responded. To this day they have not responded to emails. In other words, the issue was buried, I think, waiting for these three authors to withdraw the article, because the main authors of that article are Nassim Haramein, Olivia Lirol, and Cyprian Guermont Press. I imagine Nature is waiting for them to withdraw the article. Please tell us you no longer want to publish it with us. Which they are not going to do. They didn't do it and they're not going to do it.
Which is part of the stigma too.
No, more than the stigma, we are realizing, and this is going to touch on the point we talked about with Alcubierre, that the topic of vacuum fluctuations is a topic that is censored. The subject itself has been censored for over 100 years. And this has to do with perhaps the development of the atomic bomb. That is due to a political issue behind it, the topic of vacuum fluctuations is censored. It's a topic that just exists. I imagine that this technology and this more advanced physics are not unknown to certain groups, but they are highly controlled. And that's what he talks about. And here we are going to get into the subject, fortunately into the subject. Because the UAP phenomena that we are talking so much about right now, it turns out that if one follows that topic well, one understands who is, for example, Stephen Greer. Who is Stephen Greer? You know, we're talking big with this topic. This isn't some newbie talking. No. This is the person who is making it possible for this topic to come to light.
One of many, but yes, but it is.
As the one who has had the most visibility, perhaps, let's put it that way. Who knows? He has been saying for many years that most of the UAPs we are seeing are not extraterrestrials, they are humans. This is technology already made on Earth. Now, I'm going to tell you two things. This is a politically sensitive issue. Because if they are human, then why aren't we teaching that technology in universities? Where is that physics? Because that implies a much deeper understanding of the nature of reality than what we are teaching with existing theory. The first question. And the second, how did they find those theories? Apparently through back engineering, the reverse engineering of things that have been found for 100 years. So in whose hands has that been? And why, again, the question, has it not been made public? Why has the existence of other civilizations not been made public if that were the case? And why hasn't the issue of the existence of a more advanced science than the one we are teaching in schools and universities been made public? This is a topic that qualifies, in my opinion, as, almost assuming it were true, a crime against humanities. I mean, why? Because we are talking about energy extraction. Why what happens? If one understands well what the relationship is between mass and the electromagnetic force, if one understands well that electromagnetic fluctuations are what give rise to mass, how we go from charge to mass is one of the great mysteries. Well, if this is resolved, We would have the ability to extract energy sustainably from any point in space, which is what these technologies would do. And gravitational control is also very important because it would allow us to make an interesting species in a non-trivial, but let's say realistic way. We would go from being a type 0 civilization to a type 1 or type 2 civilization, which has to do with energy management, energy extraction, and understanding energy. That is, we would have to understand that we have understood how our understanding of the reality of nature has evolved based on our understanding of energy and its relationship to mass. In the beginning, when we burned, it was by combustion. So, well, there was the energy that was available through combustion, the little train, choo-choo and such. Then came electricity. Even before the structure of the atom was well understood, there was already electric current. It was understood that there was something flowing that produced work. Then came the compression of the atom into nuclear energy, an energy that is completely counterintuitive because the smaller you reduce the volume, the more energy there is. What it's telling you is that what's important here is the density gradient. The density gradient, no, that is how compressed, how compacted the energy is in a volume. That is why atomic energy is highly explosive. It's like you're popping a balloon that can't hold on with all the energy it has, and you're draining all that energy. So something like that. So what happens now? We stay there. And in nuclear energy, that's the biggest source of energy, isn't it? Because if we understand that mass is made up of vacuum fluctuations, then we understand, and that is the Casimir effect. That is, vacuum energy is proven by millions of experiments, the Swinger effect, the Casimir effect. In other words, it couldn't be more proven. But it is believed to be an energy that is not accessible because it is highly decoherent, random, a number of circumstances that would not allow you to really harvest it. But in reality, not all of our material comes from there. What happens is that the regime of coherence is lost as you move away from that regime of coherence, as you distance yourself. And it becomes increasingly difficult to extract energy the further you are out there. So what you have to produce is a density gradient in a much more efficient way than a Casimir chamber. Produce a density gradient that allows you to access that energy scale. You have to generate a density gradient. This is generally produced with electromagnetic fields, with rotors, producing a great intensity through rotation.
So for me, I think it's very important to mention why Jacob's theory comes into play here in such an important way. Because you, as a scientist and physicist, feel that we must give way to the importance of human consciousness. Because I feel that within all these energies that are speaking, there is inevitably a connection between human consciousness and these energies and these objects that we see in the sky. It has already been explained a lot that there is a connection between human consciousness and objects. There are also many declassified documents that talk about this. And I think that's where the problem lies. We haven't fully understood that one is connected to the other and that this energy depends on how we use it, consciously or unconsciously. It depends on that in order to rediscover it. Well, that's my personal opinion. I don't know what your opinion is, doctor.
Look at the topic. If the conscience, okay, well, it's a leap, a quantum leap. Look at consciousness as what we refer to by consciousness first. How are we going to define it here? Well, I'm going to give you this definition right now. I'm going to say it's a feedback mechanism between scales. It's an information feedback mechanism, information that goes back and forth, that is processed, that comes from one place to another. It's processed and changes scale from the proton, from the Planck scale to the universe. This theory also predicts that the universe is a black hole and proves it quite clearly. So we're talking about a concatenation of black holes. We're talking about a proton black hole. A sun would have a black hole at its center. The theory also predicts it, and it's calculated very rigorously, and that's what it predicts. You would have a black hole on a universal scale. That is, we are talking about information processors. What would a black hole be in this context? It would be a creator of matter, an organizer of matter, a concentrator of information, of energy, and it would also produce storage, information storage. That is, they are like the hard drives of the universe, let's put it this way. As if information is being processed there, information is being recycled, galaxies are being generated. They already predict that at the center of virtually all known galaxies, there is a black hole at the center, often much more massive than the galaxy itself. That is to say, those are the galactic engines. Black holes are the galactic engines. They are the creators of the galaxy, of the stars of the galaxy. And this is confirmed when you calculate that there was indeed a black hole in the center of a star. So we're talking about this concatenation of black holes at all scales that are connected through a network of entanglement. We already saw that protons have this capacity and everything. So what are we talking about here then? From an organism highly efficient in transmitting information, in producing structures, in making them coherent, because we had to see the complexity of what we are talking about in the universe, the complexity of the stars being there. I mean, let me explain. Everything works here in a highly coherent way. Where does this coherence come from? Where does a highly intertwined, highly connected, highly negentropic system have to come from, despite all the entropy that one sees there? So what does this mean? That the universe is generating increasingly complex structures. And complexity reaches the point where that subsystem reaches the point where the feedback mechanism becomes so complex that the system becomes self-aware. But what is self-awareness? Having the feedback that allows you to I am, I exist, there's someone here. So that's why I talk about it as a feedback mechanism that occurs across all scales, so that what I call the consciousness of an entity, you can't really separate it from the consciousness of everything else. That is, my consciousness is very highly intertwined. The consciousness that a bee can have of itself, a fly, a horse. Do I make myself clear? I mean, because we're all emerging from this feedback mechanism across scales. So this creates a very different worldview than what modern physics gives you. What does modern physics predict for you? It predicts systems that come from chance, that reality in its most fundamental state is highly probabilistic, that doesn't make any sense, and everything is disconnected. That everything is disconnected because if the macroscopic vacuum, that is, if the quantum vacuum doesn't count because it only impacts very small scales, and the cosmological vacuum disconnects because what it does is separate things, then everything is fundamentally separated, disconnected. And that's why it's so difficult to understand things like entanglement and everything we consider paranormal, like premonition, extrasensory perception. But if we understand that we are in a flow of information that connects all scales, what once seemed impossible now becomes evident. Or obvious, it's obvious. So you can tell me, well, but show me that what Christianity says is true. Well, prove to me that you're alive. Why are you alive? Knife, cardboard. I'll give it back to you. Okay, one of the most incredible and complex systems to understand is biology, because biology breaks with thermodynamics completely. Let's see, where is a very high level of coherence? Well, where is the source from? It's that the biological organism is highly coherent thanks to the fact that in other areas of the universe, there is a high incoherence. And I say, yes, but why are those areas of the universe connected? Tell me how they connected. Where is it? I mean, everything is very messy, very poorly explained. The origin of order is not really understood, and it is pretended that it comes from chance, and this is false. That is, it cannot be sustained. So, well, this theory I'm telling you about is out there. It's very advanced. It already predicts things that would take us to an impressive evolutionary level. It's not there, let's say. They're trying to ignore it. I mean, you can't attack it, because what one would have expected after 70,000 downloads is that the entire artillery of physicists would come to criticize and tell you where the error is. And what there is a deafening silence, a deafening silence.
That's because of the establishment that already exists, right? Because they have their incentives for which they have to work. They already have their position well secured. If they deviate from the status quo, that's at risk, and therefore their family is at risk, as is their livelihood, which is a vicious cycle, I think. The problem is how you break it, because you can get all the theories in the world out of it. To me, this theory and Jacob's theory seem essential to understanding the universe as such and ourselves as well. But how do you break it? That's the big question.
It's very difficult because there's already a very strong level of self-censorship. I mean, like I said, what you just mentioned, the convenience, the fact that I already have my 15th and final salary and all that, and I can't go against my own theories because many people who work on theories that would already be discredited with this. I mean, the standard particle model would really disappear from the scene because it just doesn't hold up and things like that. So, and getting back to the topic, but that has to do with the topic of consciousness. Our understanding has evolved with our understanding of nature, of the nature of reality. And if we realize that everything is actually a flow of information that permeates through all scales, and we understand that our consciousness is simply another consequence of this flow of information, then it stops being like another state of matter almost. So what was Jacob Grinberg also saying in some way? He said that we are all immersed in this network. It's like a huge neural network that would be the cosmic mind, since they are an intertwining network, the holographic network he speaks of. And we are all somehow interacting with this network. And from that interaction arises the perceptual reality from our neural network with this other neural network. In that interface, this reality that we perceive is produced. In this sense, the mind is not limited to the brain. It is again a feedback between systems. Between systems, he talks about the orbitals of consciousness. This is all very interesting. I had the opportunity to work on some experiments not long ago with a person who was, let's say, a descendant or let's say a collaborator of Greenberg, who was with Manuel de la Flor and other people who worked with him on the team. This is a person who kept a much lower profile, but was also working in the lab. Then he decided to come up with his own kind of experiential model because he was a meditator and trained with many people in Dzogchen Buddhism and in the Bon tradition. I mean, let's say that I had the idea of continuing some experiments that Greenberg wanted to do at the time. And Greenberg was doing some experiments that had to do with a laser. He wanted to, because he managed to do the assembly, but he didn't carry it out. A laser and see if a person is in a state of meditation and high brain coherence, which is what he calls. Let's remember that in Greenberg's theory, he says that the two hemispheres of the brain, when synchronized at high frequencies, access that universal network as if it were a sine qua non condition. You have to have a high coherence of the two hemispheres of the brain. When you achieve high coherence, you have what he calls high synergy, and you connect in some way, which is what he said Pachita could be.
Thanks to, and you make others who are with a lower correlation rise to your level as well. Do you have it yet?
Yes, because it reorganizes the structure of space. Well, exactly. Look, this is very interesting because when I meet this person, he says, well, I want to do these experiments. His name is Jose Luis Bueno Ramos. He calls his theory Shintegi. So, and the experiments had to do with, okay, let's put this person in the immediate vicinity of a laser. We're going to take all the precautions we can take so that it's not a physical effect, but rather another type of phenomenology is seen. And I'm going to tell you that on the very day of the calibration of the instruments, as a scientific physicist, I thought that with our instruments, we wouldn't be able to really measure anything because we're not sophisticated and don't imagine that the inherence of consciousness in physical reality must be, if it exists, marginal. That's what one imagines. If it exists, it is marginal. That is something that you won't be able to measure even with a super sophisticated device, or it will be something anecdotal, just as in the last significant figures of your measurement, what was perceived. Here was something quite explicit. It seemed that the phenomenon was shouting in our ears. I said, no, this is crazy. We started doing more experiments, and they were non-local experiments in time, non-local experiments in distance. So, well, of course, all of this was left as something very anecdotal. They're still being done now. Let's say that this line of research is continuing with other laboratories he's working on to see if he can corroborate the phenomenon with other types of instruments and all of that. But what I saw tested a concept I had for consciousness, which is a bit complicated here, but well, there's the concatenation of referentials that upon reaching a fractal condition coalesce or collapse into singularity. Okay, concatenation of observer points, of observers. When that relationship, that chain, let's say, of observers has a fractal condition, it meets a fractal condition, it can produce collapse, coalescence into a singularity, which means you can have a gravitational effect. My hypothesis was that consciousness was fractal in nature and that it had to necessarily have a gravitational effect for this very reason I'm telling you, because ultimately, what are vacuum fluctuations? Holographic theory sums it all up to vacuum fluctuations. There you have the point, the main actor, the fluctuation of the vacuum. But what is a vacuum fluctuation? Okay, it's a rotor that I don't know what, but yes, but you can go much deeper into that. And it's part of my work that I do separately through my own line of research called the quantum of consciousness, where I'm addressing the issue of the observer. What is an observer? How can I define an observer? And when I define that observer, I find that there is a concatenation of 4 frames of reference that when I put them together produce what I would call an observer, and that cannot be reduced to anything more than that. Four circumstances that are intertwined with each other, that when you connect them, they produce a double torus type feedback mechanism, and that's what I call a neo-retrofeedback unit, which is, for me, a quantum of consciousness or an observer. I mean, I already have a theory that I'm developing, because for me that was the most important point. So what are we talking about when we talk about a vacuum fluctuation? What is fluctuating? Energy, I said electromagnetic energy, but what is that? So, well, I'm telling you this because I've been working on this topic for 25 years since I developed those diagrams. And so when I met Jose Luis and I saw that he had all this background and all this interest in doing these experiments, I already came with a very, very advanced concept of consciousness. And it was this, the concatenation of references, that is, of observers, of those that I'm telling you about, which are the spherical Planck units, if you want to see them in Nassim's theory, which when they reach a fractal condition, when they are in a fractal relationship with each other, they can collapse because fractals have the capacity to gather infinite information in a very compact space. Okay, prudish. So the fractal condition is unavoidable here. That is, there has to be a social condition. And on the other hand, gravity would have a gravitational effect. Consciousness had a gravitational effect. So when we did the experiments and when I mentioned this concept to a physicist who was helping us, a plasma physicist, Arturo Ortiz, and he said, well, if this is true and if we're seeing such a pronounced effect, we should set up the most sensitive scales possible and timers, different timers, to see if there's any dilation. That is, he set a stopwatch and balanced it. I said, but for God's sake, this is never going to work. I mean, this is a disaster. We're not going to make it. We're going to put in 2 Arduino timers, all with Arduino therapy. I mean, here I said, no, if something comes out here, it will be a miracle. And what do you think? Every time the subject intervened, the chronometers became desynchronized. There were changes in the scale measurement. In other words, it seemed like a gravitational effect. And for a gravitational phenomenon, and that was my hypothesis, was that consciousness is a way of structuring information. Space contains information, or the structure of space is an informational network. If you change the structure of space, you are changing its properties, you are changing its viscosity, if you want to look at it that way. So a person in a particular state of consciousness can reorganize the structure of space. And if you reorganize the structure of space, you're having a kind of gravitational lens effect. That is to say, what the laser is doing is testing. That is, as I said, it serves as a test, probing the space, that is, probing its trajectory, probing the curvature of space, so to speak. I know this sounds like science fiction. I know this would be incredible if it had happened. No matter how many experiments we did and repeated it 300, 400 times, it always came out at 70% when we compared it to the baseline, because as you know, you compare the laser when there's nothing, when there's no effect, a baseline, a straight line. And when there was subject intervention, the line would do whatever it wanted. It would go up like this, down like this. But the thing is that it always happened when there was subject intervention. It didn't happen when the baseline was alone. So I was like, well, this can't be. And I said, no, I don't know. And I put myself in a rather compromising situation, because as a physicist, I had to endorse what I was seeing, saying, well, I'm going to give you this explanation. I'm going to say that, because I had already been working on the subject of consciousness and saying, well, it would be possible if we really understood what space is, what time is, and what this person is really doing with their contemplative state, with what are really much more the questions that were open than the answers that we actually obtained. And we were able to do all of this again in a much more rigorous manner. But I'm telling you this as an anecdote to tell you that Greenberg's theme seemed to be a very predominant theme here, because Greenberg was the one who not only proposed this experiment, but he was also convinced that perceptual reality is produced in the interaction between the body's neural network and the external neural network. And I say neural network, not just the brain, because we have the heart in our intestines. That is, we are all one, the whole.
Body is the whole organism. We are one.
Machine, not just the brain. So that's why I say it's not just the brain, although that coordination of the two hemispheres, he showed that it was something very important within this theory.
Essentially, Jacob thought we were quantum factories that could create reality. And it is what you are on which the work that you are doing now is based.
Yes. Right now, I'm focusing a lot on the topic of consciousness, but to describe it from the perspective of observers, what does an observer mean? How am I going to define all of this? So, a platform that I'm going to launch soon is called Serendipia Science. Serendipity science, for a reason I'll explain later. So, well, that's one of my words.
Favorites? Serendipity? That ineffable. They are the best for me, the best words in existence. Serendipity.
I started to investigate the origin of serendipity. My dad passed me by and said, "Look, did you know that serendipia comes from serendipity?" I said, "Yes, the English word is serendipity." And then while researching that, I saw that there was an island called Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, which is where the word serendipity comes from. That island was called Serendip and it was called Serendip. And there was a story that was very, how to say it, very much from the island, very native to there, that spoke of three princes who solved the island's most serious problems with coincidences.
There are no coincidences, doctor. Working in this branch of what I do, I increasingly realize that coincidences are not as common as one thinks. Everything happens because something else happened before that led to it happening. And all of Carl Jung's synchronicities also have a lot to do with that.
Completely, yeah.
What a nice conversation. Thanks a lot. Something you want to tell us about what you're doing right now, where you can find people if you want to contact you? And so let him explain to us as well, because I saw that he wrote many articles about everything that's happening with non-human anomalous phenomena and these objects and audiences. Are you still following the case or not?
Yes, I follow him. Yes, I follow him. Yes, I follow him. I follow him. Right now, for example, I'm going to have more interaction with people here in Mexico with these eyelet pieces, if you see, because this is an area in which ISF has also shown a lot of interest. Of course, with the name International Space Federation, there's a sense of, well, you can't help but see this UAP issue. I mean, it's inevitable, it's unavoidable. So I wanted to focus on that line of those popular science blog articles because it's a research project I've been conducting for several years. And I feel that the UAP topic is directly connected to the topic of consciousness, to the topic of energy, to how everything is ultimately connected. The question of what the nature of reality is, what the role of consciousness and the unconscious is. I am also much more interested in the subject of the unconscious than in consciousness as such. I mean, all of this energy extraction, gravitational control, all of these topics, in the end, you'll realize they're intimately related. And the UAP issue is like a point where all of that converges. We're talking about civilizations if these phenomena are real and come from other civilizations. We're talking about the existence of other civilizations. We're talking about civilizations that have a different understanding of the nature of reality than ours, where consciousness, science, and all these concepts have a different nuance. I don't imagine they use the same thing. No, not the same. I imagine it's very different, but we're part of the same universe. So in some way, we have to have things in common. And I imagine that the subject of so of course, these pieces that are here in Mexico seem to have a lot, well, the whole planet, there are many things that converge on this topic. The history of humanity, what is the true history of humanity? If it has been different from what we know, that is, what has there been if we have had more direct intervention than we think, our entire true history, because there are many things that are still not really explained. So by joining all those points, a much more complex landscape is woven, much more interesting in my opinion as well. And Mexico has an interesting presence in these topics. For example, Ojuelos, there are several areas in Mexico, Jalisco, I think, where there are a number of pieces that allude to direct contacts. So, of course, all of that is part of it. Many have tried to discredit them because they make copies all the time. They're selling copies here, copies there. So, no, but you can do tests.
Carbon dating and all that.
All this to determine the age. And I know that there are several pieces that they have, as far as I understand, are very well verified. They are pieces that are thousands of years old, 5,000 years old, 15,000 years old. And the things they depict are truly controversial. So, and there's been a lot more openness about this issue, even in more orthodox minds, which I think is very important because you really have to be able to convince. I mean, you have to really overcome that barrier. I mean, the barrier of the other person saying, wait for me. Yes, I mean, you really have what you're saying. If it exceeds our limit, our understanding, but it has to do with that barrier, because if we're not talking about just anything, it's just any old thing. No, those barriers are hyper, they're super important, because they're what tell you that the next step we're going to take is a well taken step in the right direction, that it's a rigorous.
And besides, the work that you and scientists like you are doing, I think is super important to also gradually remove the stigma that exists, because it's still too much. And if these issues aren't discussed in a serious scientific way, will we continue to fall into the same old trap, sensationalism, stigma, and people saying, oh, that's a complete lie, you know? So I think it's very important to continue having these conversations in mediocrity to
Ultimately, something cannot truly reach its full potential because it has become completely amorphous, formless. So, if we want to give this a good direction and see what's good, what's good within what's not good within what's good, that is, it is an exercise in super deep discernment. It is an exercise in true science, because science, if one remembers its origin, let's say etymological, is not the scientific method that came later, but science as such comes from sindere, from the word sindere, which means to cut, separate, differentiate, distinguish. That is the true scientific task, that of the mind that is constantly discerning, exercising discernment, differentiation, and contrast. So, in that sense, I think it's very important that these dialectics occur. For example, I come from a completely orthodox background. I did my entire career, the first 25 years, but then I started to have coincidences with these kinds of things that were more from my childhood, which were difficult to explain in the sense of extreme coincidences, so to speak. So I said, well, the nature of the reality that I have experienced is not really explained to me by the science that I know. I mean, there's a lot more than I can actually see with these theories. So is that part of reality or not? Look, I'll sum it up for you like this. Currently, official theory modern physics predicts 96% between dark matter and dark energy. That is, 96% of reality is not described by our modern theory of physics. 96% is too large. So when we start arguing about whether the 4% is well or poorly described, and I say, gentlemen, it's the 4%, that 96% that's left, which is supposedly dark matter and energy, what the heck is it? I mean, call him Daffy Duck God. I mean, it could be quantum entanglement, it could be consciousness, which we already know, but it needs to be defined. It needs to be defined. But he's telling you that in the majority it's 96. So we're going to get picky. I mean, I understand that rigor is important and all that, but let's be humble. I mean, 96% is everything. I mean, we're describing, and with that 4%, look at everything we've done extra too. Now I'm going to give the flowers to the 4. Is that we have managed to go to space. That is, we have a number of things that we have managed to do with the compression of 4. But imagine what we could accomplish if we got to 10.
we would become that type of civilization at least.
Yes, at least. And yes, exactly, at least. So, well, I say, just to wrap up, I think that, look, this is a very interesting stage to be in now, to see, to be aware of everything that's happening, to follow the issues with openness and curiosity, but also with self-criticism, to be critical, self-critical, not to take everything that comes as something true. Even what I'm saying here, go investigate, look for the articles I'm mentioning. There's the page of, you can find me as Ines Urdaneta Santos. I have my page on Facebook or on Instagram, Ines Urdaneta Santos. Maybe this platform that I'm going to launch online soon, which will be called Serendipity Science, and all this related to the quantum work of consciousness, will be called, you see, the science of coincidence, or serendipity, the science of serendipity, if it's called that, and the quantum of consciousness. That would be yes, very excited, because every time I present this work, which I have presented on several occasions, it is something different, people really say, and it is a very beautiful and very intuitive way of understanding what black holes are, right? It's beautiful. So I'm very excited about this, and that's also partly why this split between ISF and me is going to happen, because I'm already taking my course. I was supposed to move to France, so to speak. I've definitely decided to stay in Mexico.
So, well, I think that's the natural order of things, the way they should go, right?
Yes, I do feel it, because my soul here is Latin American, so no, but well, I continue to collaborate very well with them. I mean, I'm doing this archaeology thing through Nassim's contacts, through people who work with, I mean, we continue to collaborate on issues of consciousness and things like that. And I'm also going to continue studying physics, but here in Mexico.
Very well, doctor. Thank you very much for this delightful conversation. People are going to be very excited to hear her talk, and I hope this isn't the only time we talk, that we have other conversations in the future. Probably another one would be in English later, so that people can know and realize the type of English they speak right now. I'm going to translate this with artificial intelligence for my English audience as well, but it will first come out in Spanish for my Spanish-speaking audience. I also really appreciate your work and hope that everything you do in these areas continues to go very well. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Dad, for the invitation. It's an honor for me.
Have a great rest of your week, doctor.
Thank you very much too.
Bye, everyone. Subscribe. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye. Stay curious, inquisitive like Dot. Ines Urdaneta. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.